Hi everyone, welcome to my next video. So going on from my last video then, Storm Christopher's just hit the UK with quite substantial flooding in certain areas. So that kind of just brings home the importance of building something like a go bag, grab bag, whatever you want to call it, in the back of your car. No doubt lots of people are stranded in their vehicles, houses flooded, stuff like that. So it just, brings it home a little bit. So what I'm going to be talking about today then is just building a Basha. Now a Basha, or a Tarp in civilian talk, is like an emergency shelter. You can use it for wild camping, which is becoming more popular nowadays, or you could just use it as a brew stock, so a little shelter if it's hammering down with rain. Put a quick shelter up, get yourself underneath there, get your brew on, get your lunch on, whatever you're going to do. Or you can use it as an emergency shelter, so if someone in your party gets injured, you can set up a little shelter to get them out of the elements. Okay then, so a Basha, what is a Basha? The word Basha comes from the Second World War, when the British forces, notably the Chindits, were fighting the Japanese in Burma, and they basically were using a local word for home. So when they were setting up a Basha, that's what they're doing, they're setting up their little home for the night. So that's where the word Basha comes from. But as I said, civilian terminology, it's known as a tarp, so tarpaulin. You can get lots of different types, and I'll go through some of that in a minute. Right then, so what do we need to put up a Basha? Quite obviously you need the shelter sheet itself. So this is a military issue Basha. This is in MTP camouflage. This is the current issue Basha. It's not a bad bit of kit. It's relatively heavy but not too bad. It's about 1 kilo. The dimensions of it as it's stretched out is 2.5 meters by 2.2 approximately. It's got lots of points on it for attaching bungees and strings like these all over it, so it's really good for that. And what I've done with mine is I've prepared it by attaching my string, my paracord already, and actually tying it on so it can't fall off. This can also be used as an improvised stretcher. So it's got handles on it, you fold it in half and you can actually pick up a casualty on it. So if there's someone in your party that's broken a leg or whatever and out in the hills, you can actually use this as an improvised shelter. So it's actually got a good secondary purpose. As I mentioned, there are civilian versions out there. This is a RAB Seal Tarp 2, so this is designed for 2 people. That Basha there can take at least 2 people as well. As you can see, this is a lot smaller. It's about less than half the weight. It's about 400 grams. So great bit of kit, super lightweight, not quite as robust as one of those things. Also, this is a lot more expensive. These go for around about 100 quid. The Basha here, because it's ex-military, you can buy it military surplus. So I haven't looked how much these cost, but I wouldn't be surprised if you can get them for like 20-30 quid, something like that. So a lot cheaper. So cordage and stuff, you're going to need some sort of cordage. So paracord's great for stringing it up, or you can use bungees. I'm sure most people are familiar with these things. People use them for strapping their bikes to the car racks and stuff. The only thing with bungees is people tend to not attach them and just use the hooks and just hook it onto the Basha and hook it onto the tree or whatever. So what ends up happening is when it's under tension, if one of those hooks comes undone, they can fly off, and that can have 2 effects. It can either hit you and hurt you, like catch you in the eye or something, and the second thing it can do is just fly off into the trees. You'll never see it again, especially if we're setting one of these things up at night. So these are good, but personally I prefer the cord, because it's permanently attached, and also with the cord you could take it off and use it for other things as well, can't you? Okay, pegs. You're not always going to need pegs when setting up a Basha. You can just use the trees around you, or if you wanted to make improvised pegs, you could do that. You can get a piece of stick and just whittle it and stuff. Personally, I'd rather just carry the pegs so they're ready to go. These are the MSR groundhogs, super lightweight, really tough, and they've got a cord on the top as well for attaching your paracord through. So great bit of kit, those. Another thing you can use for elevation, or for actually fixing the thing if there's no trees around, are walking poles. Okay, so you can use these as your sort of trees, tie your Basha around it and anchor the cord to the ground. Or you can put it in the centre of the Basha to provide some elevation so the rain runs off. You can actually buy things called Basha poles, so they're specifically designed for putting a Basha up. So if you're in an area where there isn't much trees, say if you're in the desert or something, you can take those with you and use them as your points to actually fix your basher up with. But obviously with a basher pole, it hasn't got any secondary purpose, it's just there as a pole. Whereas with these things, you can use them for walking and then use them for help erecting your basher. So that's all the kit. What I'm going to do now is talk about selecting your site and where you're going to put your basher up. Right, so what I'm going to talk about next is selecting your area for your basher, preparing it, making sure it's good to go for what you need. Right, so first thing you're going to do is look at the ground. So you can see here at the ground, we've got lots of sort of debris and stuff like that. Stuff like ferns, bits of stick, stuff like that. So first thing we're going to have to do is clear the ground, alright? Make sure you haven't got any rocks in there, make sure you're not in a sodden area, because where I am here in between sort of like two little ridge lines, the water might run down, it might be totally sodden. So you don't want to be lying there, especially if you're trying to sleep there for the night. Okay, the other thing you need to look for is your actual anchor points. So have a little think in your mind, alright, where would I put my basher? Look at your anchor points. So what I've got here, what I've chosen is 2 trees. I'm looking around behind me, I could use this plus a deadfall, that tree, or just the actual slopes and peg my basher into the size of the slopes. Next thing I need to think about is the size, okay? So is this area going to be big enough to whack that basher up? And the army one there, the military one, they're fairly big, like I say, 2.5 by 2.2 metres, so it needs to be big enough, the area, to physically fit in between the trees and the anchor points you've chosen. And the last thing to think about, and probably most important, is deadfall, okay? So what's deadfall? Deadfall is where you've got trees, maybe old trees with branches that are old and rotten, and if you've got a bit of wind like actually we have today, they could actually fall off in the wind, in a storm, and fall on top of you. And as funny as that might sound, it's actually a killer. It's one of the biggest killers of people in the jungle, is deadfall falling on them, okay? So all you do is you pick your area, then you have a look up, make sure you've got nothing above you that could cause a hazard or a danger, and if you're happy then you can crack on from there. Okay then, so I've cleared my area, I've got the major sort of hazards out of the way, rocks and stuff like that. It's never going to be perfect, but I've cleared it to a degree anyway. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start getting the basher out. And first thing I'm going to look for is this centre seam here, okay? So running along this centre seam then, you've got a series of handles, and these handles are for use when you're using it as an improvised stretcher. Okay, so that's what they're for there. You actually fold the thing in half and use these handles. These run along the length of the basher, so it's longer one way than it is the other. It's like a rectangular shape. So what I want, for how I've got this set up here, I want it running lengthways, left to right as you're looking. I'm going to turn it over because this is actually the bottom side of the basher. And as you can see here, there's an attachment point with some cord attached, ready to go. That's the centre top of the basher. You can use that to elevate the basher itself. On the corners of the basher then, as I mentioned earlier, what I've got is cord pre-attached. And what I've done is I've tied those up so they're not going to get all tangled up in each other. So what I'm going to start doing now then is attaching the basher to my anchor points onto the trees. Right, so I'm moving across to the second anchor point now, and what I've got on these cords then, these are pre-prepared loops that I've tied on, and I've tied all the way along each loop. These are known as jungle knots. Basically, they're a good way of quickly getting your basher up. What you do is you just thread one through another, and it can just hold in place like so, or you can give it a bit of extra security and just tie like a quick loose knot in it like so. So they're tied on all the anchor points around the basher. So the next one I'm going to use peg. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you another thing that I use these little jungle knots for. So what I'll do is I get one of the loops, pass the actual loop of the peg through, and I pass the peg through the loop on the basher, the actual paracord. So then that will hold it in place and it can't go anywhere. So when I stick that in the ground there, if someone was to trip over that line, that peg's not going to fly off or disappear into the mud or get lost. Okay, so that's permanently affixed, or partially fixed to the cord itself now. Okay, for this side, what I'm going to use is this piece of deadfall here. I've checked that it's nice and sturdy, it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm just going to loop the cord round and through, and then just tie that off. Okay, the last bit then, you can see, I mean, this will give you a certain amount of shelter now, but if it was to start hammering down with rain, the water's going to pull onto the basher itself and it's going to start sagging. Okay, so you can either use the cord that I've already prefixed there and tie that off to a higher point. Unfortunately, where I am right now, there's nowhere to tie that off. Or you can use your walking pole, or just a piece of branch, a piece of stick, whatever. Get that underneath and place that, just give you some elevation. So there we go then. That's the basher actually set up there. That'll give you a good degree of protection from the weather. You see it's got the tension on the centre there, the rain will just run off. Okay, so that's it set up, good to go. So there's a couple of different types of basher, the actual shapes you can make. In fact, there's loads, but I'll just cover a couple of the other different types. That first one was your normal sort of standard shape. This one here is called a lean-to. As you can see, it's got one big open end here, and it goes low on the other side. It's great if it's not really raining too much. If the wind is definitely only coming from one direction, obviously the wind would want to be coming from that way through to this way. But it is quite wide and open, as you can see. It's also good for protection from the sun. So if you're in a hot environment, out in the desert something, then something like this creates a good protection from the sun. Right then, so this is the next sort of shape of basher that you can make. This is like a tent shape basically, as you can see. It's that sort of triangular shape. What we've done here is pegged the sides down pretty much to the ground, all four sides. We've used some walking poles to give it elevation. Obviously you can use some sticks or something if you can find something. And then ran some lines down from the centre points from the poles to the ground and pegged those in too. Now what this is good for is for worse weather conditions. So if it is actually raining quite hard and stuff, this is going to give you better protection from the weather, from the elements. On the sort of flip side of that, if you have a look inside now, the actual space that you've got to work with, it's not tiny, but there's nowhere near as much space inside there than you get with the bigger sort of bashers. Right then, so that's just a quick chat through putting bashers up, how they're used, what they're for, how to prep them. Hope that's been of use to some people out there. If you like what you've seen today, then like, share, subscribe, and see you again soon. Cheers.